The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Mark, Jake, Sarah, and Emily arrived at Lake Ronkonkoma, their pickup truck crunching over the gravel path that wound through the dense pines. It was August, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, the kind of sticky heat that clings to your skin. They'd heard the stories from a grizzled gas station clerk earlier that day, tales of the Lady of the Lake, a vengeful spirit who'd drowned dozens of men over the centuries, her sorrowful wails echoing across the water. Mark, a broad-shouldered college junior with a smirk that never faded, dismissed it as tourist bait, tossing their camping gear near the shore with a careless thud. The lake stretched out before them, its surface a perfect mirror of the twilight sky, so still it seemed unnatural, like it was holding its breath. They pitched their tents just 20 feet from the water, the gentle lapping of waves the only sound breaking the silence. As night crept in, Sarah, the quiet one with a nervous habit of twisting her hair, pointed out how the crickets had stopped chirping, an odd detail that made Jake, the group's jokester, force a laugh. "Maybe they're scared of Mark's snoring," he quipped, but his voice wavered. To shake off the growing unease, Mark suggested a midnight swim. "Come on, let's make this trip legendary," he said, stripping down to his shorts and wading in without waiting for an answer. The others hesitated. Sarah clutched her flashlight tighter, Emily bit her lip, but peer pressure won out. The water was colder than they expected, biting at their ankles as they stepped in, and the lake bed felt slimy, like it was coated in something alive. Emily, trailing behind, squinted into the darkness and froze. "Guys, did you see that?" she whispered, pointing to a ripple far out in the lake, moving steadily toward them. It was too smooth, too deliberate to be a fish. Mark rolled his eyes, diving under to prove his point, but when he surfaced, his bravado was gone. Something touched me," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the water's sudden stillness. They laughed it off as weeds, but the air felt heavier now, pressing down on them. Back on shore, their campfire, left smoldering, roared to life without warning, flames licking 10 feet high, twisting into shapes that looked disturbingly human before collapsing into embers. The group stood dripping and shivering, staring at the now dark shore, their shadows swallowed by the night. The campfire's unnatural flare left them rattled, their wet clothes clinging like a second skin as they huddled near the tents. The silence was suffocating, no wind, no birds, just the lake's eerie presence looming behind them. Sarah, her voice trembling, suggested they pack up and leave. "We can walk to the road if we have to," she said, her eyes darting to the water. But Jake, rummaging through his backpack, froze. "The keys, the car keys are gone." Panic surged through them like a current. They tore apart the tents, checked pockets, scoured the ground. Nothing. The flashlight's beams sliced through the darkness, revealing only the lake's glassy edge and the twisted shadows of the trees. "Maybe they fell in the water," Emily said, her voice small, but no one wanted to go back in. That's when they heard it, a sound so faint at first they thought it was their imagination, a low, melodic hum, like a woman singing beneath the surface. It rose and fell, threading through the air, wrapping around them like invisible tendrils. Mark, his skepticism fraying, stormed to the water's edge. "All right, you want to play? Show yourself!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the lake before being swallowed whole. The humming stopped. For a heartbeat, they held their breath, hoping it was over. Then the lake exploded. A column of water shot upward, 15 feet high, spraying them with icy droplets that stung like needles. From the center emerged a figure, a woman, her body half submerged, her hair a tangle of black strands that floated unnaturally on the surface. Her face was a nightmare, pale as bone, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been, yet they felt her gaze, heavy and accusing. Emily screamed, dropping the flashlight, its beams spinning wildly across the shore. In the chaos, Jake lunged forward, yelling, "We need to go!" But before he could finish, he was gone. One moment he was there, his silhouette sharp against the water. The next, he was yanked under with a sickening splash. The lake rippled outward, then stilled, as if nothing had happened. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, sobbing. "What was that? What took him?" But Mark couldn't answer, his eyes locked on the spot where Jake had vanished, where the water now pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. The three survivors stood paralyzed, the lake's surface gleaming under the moon like a predator biding its time. Jake's disappearance left a void they couldn't process. There'd been no struggle, no cry, just a sudden absence that made their skin crawl. "We need to find him," Emily whispered, her voice cracking, but Mark shook his head, his hands trembling. "He's gone. We need to get out of here." They abandoned the tents, the gear, everything, and stumbled toward the path, the flashlight flickering as its battery weakened. The humming returned, louder now, vibrating in their chests, and with it came whispers, words they couldn't understand but felt like pleas, like threats. Sarah tripped over a root, and as Mark pulled her up, he saw it, footprints in the mud, wet and fresh, leading back toward the lake. They weren't theirs. "She's following us," Sarah whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. The trees seemed to close in, branches clawing at their clothes, and the air grew colder, thick with the smell of rot. Halfway to the road, the flashlight died, plunging them into darkness so complete they could barely see each other's outlines. The humming swelled into a wail, piercing their ears, and then they felt it, a tug, not physical but deep inside, like something pulling at their souls. Emily gasped, clutching her chest, and Mark doubled over, groaning. "It's her," he rasped. "She wants us." They ran blind, crashing through underbrush, until they reached the gravel road, the distant glow of a streetlight their only lifeline. But the lake wasn't done. As they staggered forward, a figure appeared ahead, not on the path, but hovering above it, the woman, her hollow gaze fixed on Mark. She raised a skeletal hand, and the ground beneath him softened, sucking at his feet like quicksand. Sarah and Emily grabbed his arms, pulling with all their strength, screaming his name as the wailing reached a crescendo. With a final yank, he broke free, and the figure dissolved into mist. They didn't stop running until they flagged down a passing car, babbling about the lake, about Jake. The driver, an old man with haunted eyes, nodded grimly. "She takes one every year," he said, glancing back at the water. "You're lucky she didn't take you all." It was a sweltering July afternoon in 2023 when Chris, a wiry thrill-seeker with a penchant for diving, convinced his girlfriend Mia and their friend Daniel to explore Lake Lanier. The trio had rented a small cabin near the shore, its wooden porch overlooking the sprawling, murky water that glinted under the Georgia sun. Chris had heard the rumors. Boats capsizing without warning, swimmers vanishing in calm waters, whispers of ghostly hands pulling people under. But he brushed them off as superstition. "It's just a lake," he said, tossing a scuba mask onto the table with a grin. "Besides, I've dived deeper than this and lived." Mia, a cautious brunette with a sharp wit, wasn't so sure. She'd read about the lake's dark history, submerged houses, rusted cars, even a graveyard left beneath the floodwaters when the valley was drowned. Daniel, a lanky guy with a nervous laugh, sided with Chris but kept glancing at the water, its surface rippling faintly despite the still air. They decided to boat out to a spot Chris had marked, a deep section where he'd heard old structures still stood upright underwater, relics of a forgotten town. The motorboat hummed as they cut across the lake, the shore shrinking behind them until it was just a thin green line. The water here was darker, almost black, and the boat rocked gently as they dropped anchor. Chris suited up, his oxygen tank gleaming, while Mia and Daniel stayed aboard, scanning the horizon. "Don't take too long," Mia called, her voice tight. He winked, gave a mock salute, and slipped beneath the surface with a splash. For a while, all was quiet, just the lapping waves and the occasional cry of a distant bird. Then the boat lurched, hard, as if something had slammed into it from below. Mia grabbed the railing, her heart pounding, while Daniel peered over the edge. "Probably a log," he muttered, but his knuckles were white. Minutes ticked by, far past when Chris should have surfaced. Then, from the depths, a muffled thud echoed up, like metal striking metal, and the water began to churn, slow and deliberate, as if something massive was stirring below. Mia's breath caught as she stared at the bubbling water, the boat swaying unnaturally beneath them. "He's been down too long," she said, her voice rising. Daniel fumbled for the radio, static crackling as he called for help, but no one answered, just a faint, distorted hum that made their skin crawl. The churning stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness, and Mia leaned over the edge, shouting Chris's name. The lake swallowed her voice, giving nothing back. Then, a shape broke the surface, not Chris, but his scuba mask, floating up alone, its strap torn. Panic seized them. Daniel grabbed a paddle, thrusting it into the water as if he could pull Chris up by sheer will, but it snagged on something that pulled back. He yanked it free, stumbling backward, and they saw it, a faint handprint on the wood, too large and too webbed to be human, its edges smeared with silt. "What the hell was that?" Daniel whispered, his eyes wide. Mia didn't answer. She was staring at the water, where a shadow loomed beneath the boat, long and sinuous, gliding just out of sight. The radio crackled again, this time spitting out a voice, not the Coast Guard, but a low, garbled murmur, like someone speaking underwater. "Stay down with us!" It hissed, then cut off. The boat rocked again, harder, and a slick, cold hand brushed Mia's ankle from the edge. She screamed, jerking away, but there was nothing there when she looked. Daniel, frantic, started the engine, but it sputtered and died, the fuel gauge inexplicably dropping to empty. The shadow beneath grew darker, spreading like ink, and then they heard it, a rhythmic tapping, faint but insistent, coming from below the hull. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random, it matched the beat of their pounding hearts. Mia grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit, hands shaking, and fired it into the sky. The red light arced high, illuminating the lake for a moment, and in that flash, they saw dozens of shapes beneath the surface, pale and humanoid, their limbs twisted and elongated, drifting just below. The flare faded, and the tapping grew louder, joined by a wet, guttural sound, like laughter bubbling up from the depths. Trapped on a dead boat in the middle of Lake Lanier, Mia and Daniel clung to each other, the night closing in as the temperature plummeted despite the summer heat. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick and oppressive, broken only by the creak of the boat and the faint slosh of water. Mia clutched the flare gun, its last shot spent, while Daniel gripped the paddle like a weapon, his breath shallow. "We need to swim for it," he said, but Mia shook her head, her eyes fixed on the water. "You saw them. They're waiting." The shadow beneath hadn't moved, but it was still there, a stain against the lake's depths. Then, a new sound, a splash, soft and deliberate, from the starboard side. They whipped around, and there was Chris's oxygen tank, bobbing on the surface, its hose severed clean. Attached to it was a scrap of his wetsuit, soaked in blood that spread like tendrils through the water. Mia choked back a sob while Daniel cursed, slamming the paddle against the rail. The boat tilted suddenly, one side dipping low as if pulled by an unseen force. Water sloshed over the edge, icy and reeking of decay, and with it came a hand, pale, bloated, its fingers webbed and claw-like, grabbing the railing. Daniel swung the paddle, smashing it down, and the hand retreated with a splash, but not before leaving deep gouges in the wood. The lake erupted then, waves surging from nowhere, rocking the boat violently. From the chaos rose figures, dozens of them, their bodies half-formed, faces blank and eyeless, mouths gaping in silent screams. They didn't climb aboard, they just hovered, their hands brushing the hull, their touch sending shivers through the metal. Mia and Daniel screamed, huddling in the center, as the boat spun slowly, dragged in a tightening circle. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figures sank back, the water stilled, and the shadow faded. Dawn broke hours later, and a fisherman found them adrift, half-conscious, babbling about hands and voices. Chris was never recovered, his fate sealed beneath Lake Lanier's haunted depths. Locals nodded knowingly when told. "The lake don't let go," one said, spitting into the dirt. "It's still hungry." It was late October 2024 when Lauren, a freelance photographer with a love for wild places, arrived at Lake Superior's northern shore with her brother Ethan and their friend Tara. The trip was Lauren's idea. She'd been obsessed with capturing the lake's raw beauty during a storm, its waves crashing against the jagged cliffs in a symphony of chaos. They rented a rustic cabin near Split Rock Lighthouse, its weathered beams creaking under the weight of decades. The lake stretched out before them, vast and gray, its surface restless even in the calm before the forecasted gale. Ethan, a pragmatic mechanic with a dry sense of humor, had teased Lauren about the local legends. Tales of shipwrecked sailors whose bodies were never found, their voices said to call from the fog. Tara, a wiry hiker with a quiet intensity, admitted she'd felt uneasy the moment they arrived. "It's too quiet," she said, her eyes tracing the horizon where the water met a sky heavy with bruise-colored clouds. As dusk fell, the wind picked up, howling through the pines and rattling the cabin's windows. Lauren set up her tripod on the rocky shore, her camera aimed at the lake as the first raindrops splattered the lens. Ethan built a fire inside, the crackling logs a feeble shield against the growing chill, while Tara paced, her unease palpable. "Something's off," she muttered, peering out at the water. Lauren ignored her, focused on the perfect shot, until a flash of lightning illuminated the lake, and she gasped. In that split second, she saw it, a shape in the waves, humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. She lowered the camera, blinking hard, but it was gone. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice shaky. Ethan stepped outside, squinting into the dark. "See what?" "It's just a storm." But then the wind carried something, a low, mournful wail, rising and falling like a siren's song, coming from the water. Tara grabbed Lauren's arm. "We should go inside. Now." They retreated, locking the door, but the wail followed, seeping through the walls, growing louder as the storm unleashed its fury. The storm raged through the night, waves pounding the shore with a violence that shook the cabin's foundation. Inside, the trio huddled by the fire, the wail weaving through the wind like a thread of despair. Lauren clutched her camera, replaying the lightning flash in her mind, while Ethan tried to keep things light, cracking jokes that fell flat. Tara sat by the window, her face pale, watching the fog roll in, a thick, unnatural shroud that swallowed the trees and pressed against the glass. "It's not normal fog," she whispered. "It's moving, against the wind." Ethan scoffed, but even he couldn't deny the chill creeping up his spine. The power flickered then died, plunging them into darkness save for the fire's glow. That's when the knocking started, slow, deliberate taps on the cabin door, each one echoing like a hammer on stone. "Who's out there?" Ethan called, grabbing a poker from the hearth, but no one answered. The knocks grew harder, faster, until the door rattled in its frame, then stopped as abruptly as they began. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, until Tara screamed. She pointed at the window, where a handprint smeared the fogged glass, pale, skeletal, with fingers too long to be human. It lingered for a moment, then slid downward, leaving streaks that glistened like ice. Lauren fumbled with her camera, snapping a photo, the flash illuminating the room, and something outside. Through the window, they saw it, a figure standing in the fog, tall and gaunt, its head cocked as if listening. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin pinpricks of light, and its mouth stretched into a grin too wide for its face. Ethan lunged for the door, jamming a chair under the knob, while Lauren's photo developed on the camera's screen, revealing not one figure but dozens, shadowy forms lining the shore, their outlines blurred but unmistakably watching. The wail returned, sharper now, joined by whispers, names, pleas, fragments of lost voices calling from the lake. Tara clutched her ears, sobbing. "They want us out there!" The fire flared suddenly, spitting embers across the room, and in its light, they saw scratches appearing on the wooden floor, deep, claw-like marks forming a path toward the door, as if something invisible was dragging itself closer. Dawn should have brought relief, but the storm held strong, the fog thickening until the cabin felt like an island adrift in a sea of white. The scratches on the floor had stopped, but the whispers hadn't. They overlapped now, a chorus of anguish that drilled into their skulls. Lauren's camera battery died, but not before she'd caught one last image. The figures outside had moved closer, their glowing eyes pressed against the windows, their grins frozen in grotesque mockery. Ethan, his bravado crumbling, suggested they make a run for the car, parked 50 yards up the trail. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice hoarse. Tara nodded, tears streaming down her face, while Lauren gripped a kitchen knife, her hands trembling. They unlocked the door, the wind slamming it open with a force that nearly knocked them back, and stepped into the fog. It was cold, clammy, wrapping around them like wet hands, and the wail surged, so loud it rattled their teeth. The trail was a blur, rocks slick underfoot, branches clawing at their clothes. They moved in a tight huddle, guided only by memory, but the fog distorted everything. Trees loomed like twisted figures, the path seemed to stretch endlessly. Then Ethan stopped, his breath hitching. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Beneath the wail, a new sound, footsteps, heavy and uneven, crunching behind them. They turned, and the fog parted just enough to reveal it, a figure, taller than any man, its body a mass of dripping, blackened flesh, its arms dangling past its knees. It didn't run, it shambled, each step deliberate, its glowing eyes locked on them. Tara bolted, screaming, and the group scattered. Lauren tripped, the knife skittering away, while Ethan yanked her up, shouting for Tara. They found her at the shore, the car forgotten, staring into the lake. The fog had cleared there, revealing the water's surface, alive with faces, pale and bloated, pressing up from below, their mouths moving in silent pleas. The figure emerged behind them, its breath a rasp like breaking ice, and the lake surged, waves reaching out like hands. Tara stepped forward, entranced, and before they could grab her, she was pulled under. No splash, no struggle, just gone. Lauren and Ethan ran, the figure's footsteps fading as they reached the road, collapsing as a truck's headlights pierced the fog. The driver, an old fisherman, didn't ask questions, just drove, muttering, "Superior keeps what it takes." Tara's body was never found, and the photos on Lauren's camera showed only static, as if the lake had erased its own secrets.